This is in a way the crescendo. We've been moving along the value chain. We're expanding today to talk about broader economic and social impacts. And the subtext here is to think about what the policy agenda might be, and also are there research gaps and what the research agenda might be. And so we'll do the same as yesterday. We'll give each panelist time to set out their stall. Maybe you want to talk to each other and ask questions of each other afterwards, which is absolutely fine. I would encourage us to make this a conversational piece. And Sabrina is joining us online. So we'll go down the line here. Aled, Bill, Jade, Rashad, and Sabrina. So, Aled, over to you.
Thank you. So yes, I am Aled Lloyd Owen. Not Aled Jones, though I am Welsh and have a lovely singing voice. So there we go. But yes, I'm here from Responsible AI UK. We are the UKRI funded convener of the AI ecosystem in the UK across all nations and institutions, etc. And the question that was posed to us today was around how policymakers can manage the risks of AI and ensure public good. And I think we all agree that the risks and opportunities are both broad and fast moving. They're multidisciplinary, they're multi-sector, they're local, they're regional, they're global. And there is a real question about how we respond. And so my focus today is to think about actually what's holding policymakers back from making significant decisions in this space. Now, when we think of the policy response, we tend to think about our inputs and what we can lean into the conversation on this. And the systems in place work well, they're very mature. So there are systems in place for Whitehall to convene and gather information from academics and researchers, from industry, from the public, through consultations, technical advisory boards. There are scientific advisors. They're now recruiting technical experts into the civil service. And of course, we have institutions like AC that have been set up as well to address some of these challenges. And so there's no lack of willingness, I think, on the part of government to listen to external perspectives and advice and to take that in to make good policy with good outcomes. And there's certainly no lack of willingness from the community that's represented here today and beyond to speak and to be part of that process either. And the challenge is more in the space, therefore, of where the decision-making currently sits in the landscape. So at the moment, the question of what the UK's response to AI regulation and AI policy is remains highly strategic. That means within the Whitehall decision-making apparatus, that is political. And political decisions need political payoff. So the broad policy discussion that's currently happening is not particularly mature. It treats AI as a homogeneous blob. There is a challenge, particularly with the broader public and electorate, where AI is perceived as both, well, more as an end rather than means. And therefore, there is no separation, rather, of desired outcomes from the technology itself, which conflates the issues. Add to that the fact that public understanding, in a broad sense, is influenced by a variety of sources, some reliable, some not, social media, podcasts, blogs, alternative media, etc., as well as legitimate sources. And you have a really significant challenge that arises from that, which is, where is the political payoff to be made? And the risk that the political decision-making process has to contend with is, right now, there isn't really a sense that there are votes to be won in this space. And you saw that at the last general election with the lack of space given to AI in manifestos and in speeches, etc. But there are definitely votes to be lost if you get it wrong. And so that leads to, I think, a nervousness in terms of taking things forward. The fear of getting things wrong politically, as well as in terms of the actual outcomes that we're looking for from various attempts to regulate and drive forward AI adoption. And so there's also the gap, therefore, between what is announceable and politically rewarding and what's deliverable and what the practicalities are. And in terms of having good policy that has positive social impact. Now, at that level, we've got the very mature systems in place that I've laid out, and there's sort of strong prospects there, but you still need to bring the political along with that. And that needs a strategic shift in terms of the national conversation, in terms of empowering government to take political risks and to get the rewards that they perceive politically from taking action and avoiding the negative impacts that naturally may come from this. And technical communications around these issues which have a strong technical base, particularly where you have a general public who have a not particularly well-informed or consistently informed position on what the technology actually is, what it does, and the separation between means and ends in terms of its deployment, carries enormous risk. In 2017, after the terror attacks in the UK, the Home Secretary Amber Rudd tackled the issue of end-to-end encryption and access to communications. Now, she made one minor slip-up in terms of the technical questions, and in a TV interview, and in doing so, the government's credibility on the issue evaporated. It took 3 years for it to rebuild really properly and to restore confidence in its ability to understand the technicalities. So there's a huge risk there in terms of engagement and challenging this issue. The challenge also is that in order to have confidence in the decisions and the policies that are being put forward, there is a desire, not just among the voting public, but also in industry as well, to have some detail that demonstrates there's a degree of expertise underlying the decisions that are potentially being taken. Now, the problem is that if you go into that detail, you run the risk in the media environment that we have of having that detail carved up into sound bites. And even if you don't have that impact, you also have the significant risk that you will lose your audience, because once you start to get technical, a lot of people will switch off, or you get dragged deeper and deeper into the conversation. It's not politically viable, certainly not not viable in a communication sense. Or the alternative is that what you are delivering, you have to dilute, and you have to dilute it by going into the minutiae of detail in terms of problem-solving issues. So if you have a bill that is meant to solve problems that are perceived to be caused by AI, you might fall into the same trap that the Online Safety Act had, which is to list each individual problem and legislate for its correction, rather than creating perhaps more effective, adaptable regulation. So there are a lot of pitfalls there. And how do you overcome it? Well, I think the key thing is to shift the national conversation, and it's been demonstrated that government has the ability to do that. It actually did it successfully on encryption, which was a less sort of significant national conversation. And during the pandemic, it was also demonstrated that actually government can create information campaigns that can bolster public understanding. I think that's really key to giving political confidence to take decisions. But also within that, you have other options that can help build credibility. So if ministers need to talk about these these technical issues, that they bolster themselves by appearing alongside their technical advisors rather than assuming the mantle of having to explain these things themselves. What can the community do to provide them with that expertise whilst maintaining their independence and not simply being sort of mouthpieces of government, but providing credibility and endorsement? And finally, how can public education really be driven forward? What is the role of researchers, academics, and industry to explain the way in which these systems work, to bolster public trust in them, and again, create the right environment for government ministers to be able to take political decisions confidently, and in doing so, unleash the potential of that much more mature, sector-specific policy conversation that is already happening within Whitehall departments, in order to be able to actually take a step forward and start producing effective AI-related policies that will be for the benefit of the public, drive innovation and economic prosperity.
I want to follow up with a question straight away, Aled. When you raise a really interesting point about the public conversation. I've been collecting Daily Star front pages for my slides, and there are things like, attack of the psycho chatbots. And I'm just wondering to what extent you think the research community itself has contributed to a not very helpful public conversation, both through the technical fears, the existential fears, but also economists talking about it's going to eat all the jobs in the way that we just heard about.
I think it's an interesting point. The way in which the national conversation really started in terms of AI happened under the last administration, and it happened in terms of the arrival, obviously, of generative AI. And the response was the AI Safety Summit in Bletchley, and the focus immediately turned to safety, security, how do we protect ourselves from these threats? So that's point one. That's set up a difficult national conversation to move on from, particularly in terms of seizing opportunities. I think the risks are a legitimate question for researchers to tackle. I think the problem is being able to find compelling ways in which to sell that to the media in terms of actually the opportunities moving forward. So the Daily Star has plenty of doom and gloom headlines, but it also celebrates the boffins' great breakthroughs as well with fair regularity. And it's finding those good news stories to also push them quite aggressively, actually, in terms of what is AI doing that is better, what is benefiting the public. But we can't be complacent about the risks either. And unfortunately, that is the nature of the news cycle and why the credibility question is really important for government to answer.
Thank you. Let's move on to Bill.
Thank you, Diane. Thanks. And thanks for that, Alid. Actually, just to pick up on your last point, I think it's not just the last 3 or 4 years of fears about generative AI and existential risk. It's 50 or 100 years of science fiction narratives and that have really created a problem. And the work that people like Cantor Dihal and Stephen Cave did a few years back to expose the ways that we talked about AI, if like in popular culture, was very helpful. We don't seem to have changed our views though very much. We don't seem to escape from it. I have a rule, no Terminator pictures in any presentation. It's a start. It's a small start. I'm Bill Thompson, and I work for the BBC. And the BBC is interesting because it's an organisation created in 1927, and it was created to deliver the benefit of communication technologies to the nation and the world. And for the last 100 years, it's been one of the biggest interventions in how technology should be used to deliver public value and public good. And whilst I'm not suggesting it's a model for how we do things, I don't think we need a BBC AI, I do think it's interesting to see that governments can do things which have long-term impact and which significantly affect the ways particular technologies are deployed, and not just in the UK and across the world. So it's a model for the fact that interventions can make a difference. And I hold on to it sometimes. It's one of the reasons why I like working there. And the BBC has been using AI for decades now, in fact, because the technology is not very new, for things like machine vision systems, some of our recommendations engines, for things like efficient codecs for video compression. But it's been since the emergence of generative AI, the pre-trained transformers and all of that, that things have really taken off, obviously. And I think that discourse around generative AI has created a genuine crisis. There's so much hyperbole. There's so much concern about the capabilities of the systems. There are so many policy failures. You've alluded to some of them in terms about how we talk about AI around the world. We have resistance to the deployment. We have the excessive lobbying, and we have the reality that these technologies seem to be unavoidable. Whilst we think about them at the moment as being somehow distinctive and special, they're not fairy dust. They are just another layer in the computational infrastructure that shapes the world. But over the past 40 or 50 years, we have come to rely so much on the capabilities of computation, silicon-based systems, and the networks that connect them. And what AI in all its forms is doing is just adding something which will eventually become invisible to view. I know that most of our engagement these days with Gen AI systems is through chatbots and things like that, which advertise themselves. Every app you use on your phone, as currently you'll discover, has a little circular button appearing somewhere in the user interface that you will inadvertently click on, that will open up an AI helper that will offer to compose your Instagram messages or analyze your metadata or whatever, because they're being put there. And there's a good reason for that, which is that all of the companies who've invested massively in generative AI over the last few years, the profits for that have already been baked into their share price, and they know that. They have to extract value from all of us over the next few years, and they will stop at nothing to do it. And that is one of the reasons why figuring out ways to deliver public value and ways to do this responsibly and ways to affect the policy framework is both important and incredibly difficult, because there's an enormous tide of resistance to doing it well, because the money made by these companies will rely in many cases on us doing it badly. And I think that's one of the things we can reflect upon. In recent years, one of the books that's guided me in my thinking about AI has been Professor Kate Crawford's Atlas of AI. And I presume many of you have read it or know it. And it's a really good exploration of, if like, the physical grounding of these systems. The fact is that, we are encouraged by the Daily Star and others to think about psycho chatbots as somehow separate from the world. But of course, they're based around silicon. They're based around machine systems that have to be mined and built and powered with electricity. They're based around extractive human labor, based around the extraction of human culture, all of these things. And what Kate does in her book, which is as much as psychogeography as an atlas, is help us get that into context and be able to help us think properly around how these things fit in the world. And one of the nice things about the last 2 days has been the way in which we've explored, if like, both the geography and the psychogeography of AI, talking about chip manufacturers and distribution, talking about value generation, talking about just today the economic impact, talking about the absurdity of artificial general intelligence as a goal in Neil's first talk, and all of the different ways in which generative AI is being used and all the different challenges it poses for policymakers. I still regret the fact we use the term AI. I still regret the fact we call it artificial intelligence. I'm with Stuart Russell. If we'd called it computational rationality back in 1956, the world would be a better place now. But we seem to be stuck with that. And so we ask ourselves, how do we secure these benefits? We had a really interesting conversation. Sorry. Not designed for these notes. I should have stood to the lectern. We had a really interesting conversation around the dinner table last night for some of us. And at one point, there was a sort of thoughts about whether access to AI, whether the use of AI is some sense becoming an inalienable human right, something that everybody's going to need in order to be able to work and live more effectively. And I was one of the people pushing back against that, just as I pushed back against any attempts to reclassify the internet as somehow a human right. It feels to me that these technologies have become ways in which things like freedom of speech and freedom of expression, freedom of association are delivered. And they need to be taken account of in the frameworks that we are developing. But the technologies themselves should never be named specifically. We're in the process of thinking about what goes into the next BBC Charter, which will come into effect in 2028. And one of the points I'm making is we mustn't talk about AI, because it is a specific tool and a specific technology. And similarly, to reflect one of the points that Philip made earlier, current forms of generative AI, large language models, pre-trained transformers, these are a passing phase in the development of these technologies. They will, if not be superseded and replaced, they will be augmented by other systems. It's perfectly clear that they cannot deliver all of the things you would expect to get from agent-based systems and others. The characteristics, the statistical uncertainties and stochastic mechanisms that underpin large language models make them fatally unsuitable for certain activities. And we know we have other approaches to AI. We've been doing sort of artificial intelligence work for 50, 60 years. We know that there are different ways to do this. And I think we're going to see some interesting experimentation coming out of that as we reach the limits of what LLMs can offer. We also need to take account, and I think in our conversations last day or two, there's been a focus on the UK reasonably and on Europe. But obviously the geopolitics of all of this, we talked about the US and China, we talked about the gaps between the north and south, become deeply important in terms of the boundaries between different jurisdictions and whether it's even feasible to begin to make policy that just applies to one country. I don't think you can have socialism in one state I'm not sure you can have AI policy in one state either these days. And I'd like to sort of that to be something we talk about. And it's also clear that whilst the whole premise of this conference is about the AI value chain and we're used to value chains, it's really a connected graph. That actually what you've got are so many interconnected nodes in which value is created and extracted that we can't think about it in any sense as a linear process. And there's an old adage that the internet as a network is designed such that it treats censorship as damage and routes around it. And I fear that the AI value chain is set up to treat regulation as damage and route around it. And one of the real problems we're going to face is finding ways in which you can adequately regulate these technologies that cannot just be avoided by the actors involved in it. And for me, that comes down to some of the technical design. One of the flaws with the internet is that it was designed to be unregulable. The engineers who built it built a very efficient mechanism for moving bits around, and it works. They did not think about the aspects of what happens when those bits are being used to do bad things, because it didn't occur to them they might be. It was people like them who were using the network. We're building large language models, we're building other technologies without any thought to how they might be controlled. And I wonder whether there's an analogy with aircraft here. So bear with me for this one and see if this one flies, literally. A passenger aircraft is an amazing piece of engineering. And I don't know if any of you come across the term vomit comet. A vomit comet is where you basically fly a parabolic flight path in an aeroplane such that you get a period of weightlessness at the top of the curve as you come down because you're essentially in free fall. And it's used for astronaut training, it's used for recreation by some strange people, and it's astonishing what the planes can do. Well, the planes that do it are Boeing 727s, they're passenger jets. The plane that flies you to Malaga or New York could do that, but it doesn't. It's designed to fly within a very restricted performance envelope that makes the experience of getting on an aeroplane bearable to normal people who do not want to be reminded that they are in a metal tube 5 miles above the ground, hurtling at 400 miles an hour, because that's actually quite an uncomfortable thing for a human being to experience. And I wonder whether what we're going to see is the development of AI technologies that are extremely powerful, that are bounded in the ways that aircraft are bounded, such that their operations day to day conform to the norms that each society reflects and desires. We don't build technologies that are limited in what they can do. We build technologies and then limit what they can do. And perhaps one of the things we need to start thinking about is how you would build those controls, those mechanisms in to allow these systems to be flown safely. And then my last point is about this process itself of what we are doing, because we are starting to use these tools in the process of developing policy. I'm sure many of the civil servants are doing this. We know famously that the Tony Blair Institute loves to feed things into ChatGPT or other models and come out with conjectures on the basis of it, and then present these as if somehow they're grounded in scientific fact because they've done it 2 or 3 times now. And it's reasonable to be using these tools as we develop policy, but also we all know how biased they are. We know the issues we have with them. And I worry that we're witnessing a bit of Gell-Mann amnesia. Do you know about Gell-Mann amnesia? Richard Feynman described this around Murray Gell-Mann, a famed fellow physicist, said Murray would open a newspaper and he'd read an article about something he knew something really well and say, this is terrible. This article is so inaccurate. Look, they spelled that name wrong and that's not where they live. I can't believe how bad this journalism is. He'd turn the page and say, and have you heard what's happening in Pittsburgh? It's awful. Look at these terrible things. When you know something in detail, you understand its flaws, but then you forget. And I really worry that we will become so dependent on the tools ourselves that we will forget their flaws as we use them to develop our own policy. So I think we need to be very cautious about how we rely on the very systems that we've been critiquing for the past 2 days in the work we're going to be doing, trying to regulate those very systems. Let's not get too reflexive.
I want to go back, Bill, to one of the earlier points you made. Are we able to articulate well the public value potential of this technology? And do we have the ability to envision a quite interventionist role for the government, for the state, in creating that public value, given that we're coming out of 40 years of Thatcherite, Reaganite free market philosophy?
I'd say almost certainly not, as in, and perhaps also maybe we shouldn't. So articulating the public value that comes directly from AI then attributes things to a certain, I say, layer of computational infrastructure. And I'm not sure that it's helpful to do that, rather than to try to identify the public value that comes from the policy initiatives or the economic growth that is made possible. So perhaps we don't want to credit the LLMs and the AI systems with it. Perhaps we want to move quite quickly to a point where they become irrelevant to the conversation, and it's just that a set of tools are available. I doubt anyone, in fact, okay, I'm going to say something, and I know when I say it, one of you is going to spend time doing this project. I'm about to say, I doubt anyone evaluated the economic impact of the facts on US public policy in the 1960s, but I'm pretty sure one of you did a thesis on it because it's that audience. But the thing is that there are some technologies where we quickly move on from the conversation about that technology into how it really affects things. And I think we're a bit stuck with AI because it's such a big thing about talking it. It's not a unitary thing anyway. It would not make sense to accumulate all the different impacts because it's used in so many different ways. So I think I'd rather move the conversation away from that. There's the bigger question about how we measure public value anyway.
There's my heart. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is that a reasonable approach?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move on to Jane. Okay.
You're...
So, hi, I'm Rad. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Next slide, please. Can you go on to the next slide? Thank you. So, my question is, can we explain how computing systems work? So what interests me generally is to try and explain how computing systems work and the consequences of interacting with them. I'm not sure how to read this. Historically, I have focused on concurrent computing systems such as multiprocessor chips that you can find in ARM systems or NVIDIA systems, or operating systems such as Linux. And I have done this at various institutions. Currently, I'm a professor of computer science at UCL in London and also a fellow at ARM here in Cambridge. Next slide, please. So a way to explain how systems work is to write specifications. And specifications can either spell out each and every step a system can take in which order, or abstract away the steps and simply describe the envelope of behaviors that a system is allowed to exhibit without any prescription as to how it's going to exhibit those behaviors that are legitimate. Next slide, please. So as it happens, this is the style of specification that ARM has adopted. So ARM produces architectural specifications, and the ARM architecture defines the envelope of behaviors that are allowed to be exhibited by ARM hardware implementations. In other words, the ARM architecture is a contract that hardware needs to honor. And this is defined in a document that's called the ARM Architecture Reference Manual, which is around 15,000 pages, mostly of English prose. So a big prose document. Next slide, please. As we all know, reading prose can lead to misinterpretation. And you can see unwanted consequences. You imagine that your goal is to depict a pink pony on a concurrent computing system, but you've misunderstood the specification. It can lead to your pony looking broken or looking healthy, depending on how you've interpreted the specification. So we alleviate this in the team I lead at ARM by providing a formal specification. So in other words, a specification that's underpinned by mathematics. This sidesteps the ambiguity of the prose and reduces the risk of misinterpretation. But it's at the cost of potentially staggering amounts of rather complex details. And you can see an example of that on the board here. This is a genuine ARM spec, it contains math. So formal specification, therefore, may not be the most accessible type of specification. And we alleviate this further by providing a queryable specification. In other words, a specification that can be interacted with and tested. You can see a screenshot of the web interface of the queryable specification over here. So this also provides a way for us to measure whether hardware honors the architecture. In other words, whether implementations honor the contract they're supposed to respect. One can ask, is this behavior allowed? And I point to this with the arrow here. The way we ask whether behavior is allowed is still in a rather codified way. Next slide, please. So this is where AI comes into play for me and my team is, I believe that AI can provide a conversational interface to specifications, whether formal or not, but it's going to be at the cost of spreading possibly unsound information. Whereas formal specifications can provide a ground truth against which to check AI answers, but it's at the cost of digital exclusion. So this tension between the two levels of granularity, the way we render the same facts is of immense interest and a research priority for my team at the moment. So moving on to the public sphere, because what I've seen in my interactions with engineers at ARM and elsewhere is just a specific instance of a more general problem of how we communicate facts to different audiences. So can we explain how computing systems used in the public sphere work? For example, algorithms that are envisaged for decision making. So this is a screenshot of a report I found on gov.uk page where participants to a workshop were asked to share their views, opinions and fears about what was called algorithms generally that might be used for decision making. And at the end, they were asked to produce a leaflet to communicate to other members of the public the fact that such an algorithm might be used and give points of contact, etc. So next slide, please. So the report itself is a remarkable read and contains a few points that I wanted to highlight. So overall, it seems that the members of the public who were interviewed were asking for complete specifications on principle. So in principle, all categories of information about the decision-making algorithms should be made available to the public, is a direct quote. But when they were confronted with what that actually meant, much like my former specifications, they had to admit that they might not engage with the full reality of what such a system, how such a system might work, and instead abdicated their reviewing of the legitimacy of that system to experts such as journalists and researchers. And for themselves, they simply wanted a simple summary of the same facts. So perhaps, I hope I have made clear the analogy between what I try to do for engineering specs and what I think we can do for policy and decision-making algorithms, which is, I wonder if we might envisage, much like in computer architecture, to provide formal specifications of policies, which would rigorously describe the envelope of behaviors that are allowed to be exhibited by legitimate decision-making algorithms. It's not unlike your plain thing. As well as queryable specifications of policies, which would enable experts to measure whether decision-making algorithms do honor these policies. And finally, accessible specifications of policy, which would allow the general public to understand or at least get an intuition of what decision-making algorithms can and cannot do. So you will see that the image I've chosen for that is matryoshkas because they all represent the same thing. They're nested levels of abstraction in the way we communicate the same fact, hopefully. And there's genuine, both theoretical and practical computer science behind this. It's a field that's called semantics in computer science, how we describe systems in ways that are accurate or partial but sound, and how we render those facts in to the right level of detail for the audience that we address. Thank you.
That's absolutely fascinating. So I guess one of the concerns I have about using algorithmic systems or AI in public decision making is that there are some areas where there are facts. You might say, what's the law about how much tax I should pay in this context? But there are others where there isn't necessarily a correct answer and there are conflicts of interest. So in those latter cases, how does that work in the sort of hierarchy that you just set out there, the Matryoshka dolls?
So if you don't believe, sorry. I suppose a way of understanding what you just said is if you don't believe there are facts we can ground on our policies on, then this doesn't work, but we have a much bigger problem in my view, right? This will only work for areas of policymaking where we do have facts.
I guess I'm not sure I think it's a problem. I just think in many domains of public policy, you are adjudicating between the interests of different groups and there just won't be facts. It's a question of judgment there.
Oh, okay, but this in itself is something you can measure. You can spell it out as the envelope of behaviors that are accepted.
Okay. Thank you. That's super interesting. Let's now move on to you. Thank you. Should be there.
Great. Does this move it forward and back? Yeah, great. Okay, so thank you everyone for having me. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So thank you everyone for having me. My name is Rashad Abelson. I'm joining from the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct. I was asked to join to explain what responsible business conduct is as a concept and how it's being used by policymakers to address harms of AI systems while also encouraging the positive contributions of businesses to society. The Center for Responsible Business Conduct is the part of the OECD that works on the development and implementation of government-backed standards on how businesses can address the negative impacts on human rights, on labor, on the environment that are caused by their own operations, but how they can also leverage their position in the value chain to address impacts caused by their business relationships. You may have already heard, or something kind of very popular in this kind of part of the policy world, various approaches to AI safety, various technical standards on the development and on the deployment of AI. While those standards focus on the product itself, the responsible business conduct approach focuses more broadly, so on the management systems and the internal processes that a company would have in place to make sure that it can proactively identify risks in its value chain or in its operations, and then take steps to address those impacts. So when we say address impacts, we mean businesses are taking steps to prevent potential impacts from occurring, risk management, and then when they do occur, to take steps to mitigate the impact or participate in remedying the impact. Yeah. So just a bit of background on where this is coming from. The OECD's work on responsible business conduct actually started in the 1970s. With the adoption of the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct. So these guidelines are the most comprehensive, the oldest international legal instrument providing direct recommendations from governments to business on how they're expected to act vis-a-vis human rights, labor, their impacts on society, their impacts on the planet. They cover all areas of so-called business ethics. So governance, disclosure, human rights and labor, corruption, competition, and of course, consumer health and safety. These guidelines are updated approximately once every decade, with the most recent update happening in 2023, and they've been endorsed now by 51 governments. So a central part of the guidelines is the expectation that businesses in these governments' jurisdictions carry out risk-based due diligence to find and address the negative impacts in their operations and in their value chains. So, next one, please. Yeah, thanks. So just want to zoom in a little bit on what those due diligence expectations are and kind of how they're explained in the M&E guidelines. This is obviously an oversimplification showing the 6 steps of the due diligence process. I think the key takeaway from this is that governments expect this due diligence process to apply in all sectors of the economy by all different types of companies. And it's a common risk management framework that we've seen applied first in mineral supply chains when this work was started, but continuing now in agriculture and garment and footwear and in the development and use of technology. So under this framework, companies are expected to embed responsible business conduct into their internal policies and management systems, expected to map out their own operations and their supply chains to get a better understanding of where the risks are, and then prioritize and take action to prevent or mitigate those risks. Step 4 is to track the results of their own activities to make sure that their due diligence efforts are effective. Step 5 is to communicate publicly on what they're doing. So what their risk management looks like, how they're prioritizing risks, what's within scope, why they're deciding to prioritize certain risks over others, and just explain publicly on what how they're approaching due diligence. And then step 6 is where there is an impact caused by the company to provide remedy for the impact, or if it's caused by a business relationship, to leverage your relationship to promote the provision of remedy. Some key characteristics of RBC due diligence is that it's risk-based. So prioritizing which risks to address first is really critical to the process. It's meant to be flexible, and it's no one expects 100% impact-free operations and value chains overnight. It's really meant to be a risk-based approach. It involves transparency and ongoing engagement with your business relationships, with affected communities, with regulators and other stakeholders. And it's very context specific. So it's flexible and it should be tailored to specific operations and supply chains. These characteristics we think are essential for promoting risk-taking that's necessary for innovation. And it's why this approach has been adopted by many OECD governments, specifically on AI, but also on issues more broader than AI. So a key message for companies implementing RBC and for governments developing RBC policies is that the goal of due diligence is not to prevent companies from doing business. It's not to be innovation stifling, but it's meant to promote increased innovation, investment, and trade, but in a way that society can trust. So while this OECD standard itself is voluntary, 75% of OECD countries have now incorporated it into law or directly referenced this due diligence framework in other kind of government-backed hard and soft law risk management expectations. So it is being used as a policy tool for responsible and trustworthy AI and among other addressing other issues in the economy as well. So right now we're working on. Next slide, please. Thanks. So right now we're working on taking the 6-step framework and adapting it and contextualizing it to AI value chains. Here's a really hyper-simplified view of an AI value chain. It's just meant to illustrate what types of actors are involved, but in a lot of AI value chains, the same company could occupy kind of each of these 3 groups. It could also be, a complex web of kind of interconnected relationships comprising hundreds of companies. So this is just kind of a simplified view just to give you an idea of what types of actors are in AI value chains, where the impacts are actually happening, and what kind of actions different companies can take to address those impacts or to leverage their position in the value chain to address impacts caused by their business relationships. So our approach to responsible AI looks at suppliers of AI inputs. That includes the financial sector, so investors. It includes suppliers of digital inputs like data enrichment services and data set curators. It includes also kind of hardware inputs into the AI value chain, so semiconductor manufacturers and digital infrastructure providers who have very significant leverage on their business relationships. That middle segment of the supply chain are enterprises who are actively involved in the development of AI systems. We call it the AI system lifecycle. And then on the far end are the users of AI systems. So these are companies who are using AI in their operations, products, and services. So under this framework, under the OECD framework, companies are expected to understand how they are causing impacts themselves in their own operations, but also how they can leverage their position to address risks more broadly in the entire value chain. Next slide, please. So obviously, we're not the only ones developing a due diligence framework for responsible AI. In the last 2 years, we've seen a huge proliferation of international and national and industry-led initiatives on risk management and responsible AI. Rather than developing a new AI framework just for the sake of it, we made sure that this guidance responds to practical needs from companies and from regulators and policymakers. So at the OECD, we're really uniquely positioned to bring together best practices from frameworks across the OECD under the umbrella of an overarching risk management framework that was developed decades ago and that was already endorsed by the entire OECD plus 13 other governments. So what we're trying to do is bring all of this together and bridge the gaps, but also help companies understand how to navigate the requirements under different frameworks that are maybe saying things in different ways, but all have similar objectives and kind of generally similar structures. So in parallel to developing our risk management framework, we're also developing an easy-to-use online tool that acts as a roadmap, particularly targeted at companies, but relevant for all kinds of stakeholders, that shows how the OECD risk management process actually maps directly to related provisions from other risk management frameworks and actually how they relate to each other. So here's just kind of an example of 3 different frameworks that we looked at as part of this roadmap, the EU AI Act, the Korean AI Act that was just adopted a couple months ago, and then various ISO standards, the ISO 31000 on risk management, and then ISO 23894, which contextualizes 31,000 for AI developers. And as you can see, the 6 steps of the OECD process, well, maybe not step 6, but the 5 steps, the first 5 steps are actually all almost directly mirrored in the other frameworks. So theoretically, a company operating in Korea, but with enough of market presence in the EU to fall under the jurisdiction of both laws, could use this framework to better meet the expectations under both jurisdictions, but also considering that the OECD framework is been endorsed by 51 governments, use this kind of risk management methods to increase market access and build trust in other jurisdictions that maybe don't have a legal framework in place, but where these are still voluntary expectations. So I'm thinking Canada, Australia, the US, where they've taken more of a voluntary approach on AI risk management. These next few slides, I go through them really quickly. It's just a kind of a case study on what this would look like in practice. I'm using an AI chatbot developer as an example here, and it just shows what kind of questions a company would ask itself as they go through this process of embedding policies, identifying impacts, addressing the impacts, prioritizing and everything. So these are just some kind of questions that companies would be asking themselves. The reasons behind asking these questions and the type of actions companies should take are covered in a lot more detail in the guidance that we're developing, which we hope to be publishing very, very soon. So we can just move quickly through this. Don't want to waste everyone's time, but I'd be happy to answer questions on practically how this would be applied. We don't have to go through it in detail, and I think I'll stop my presentation there. But happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So our final speaker, Sabrina Küspert from the EU AI office, is going to be online. So I think we need a moment to change the screen. But while that's going on, Rashad, can I ask you who defines the risks and what incentives are there for companies to engage in this process?
Both great questions. So in terms of defining the risk scope, what we did is, first we had the MNE guidelines as kind of our foundation. Like I said, it's been endorsed by 51 governments. It's been developed and updated decade after decade through a really significant consultation process involving society, workers' representatives, various governments, OECD and non-OECD, so producing countries that maybe haven't endorsed the guidelines, but who are definitely impacted by it. And so it's a really thorough consultation process. It's rooted in international instruments, UN Declaration on Human Rights, ILO standards on labor protections, COP21 kind of agreements on environmental impacts. So we drew from all of those. We circulated it to our expert groups to figure out what's the kind of the whole kind of landscape of risks. What are the highest priorities? So the most severe and likely impacts for AI value chains. And that's how we honed in on what the risk scope should be. But we say that it's meant to be context specific. So every company would have a different risk of depending on what they do and where they are in the value chain. In terms of incentives, like I said, 75% of OECD jurisdictions incorporated this into law. So there is a compliance incentive. But even on the voluntary side, governments have put in place what are called national contact points for responsible business conduct. And these are essentially government offices that are non-judicial mechanisms for hearing complaints of violations of the guidelines. So essentially, if a company is causing a human rights impact or facilitating a human rights impact through its relationships, its business relationships, then representatives can go to these government offices and help negotiate a remedy with the company that's facilitated by the government to determine whether the company violated the M&E guidelines and what kind of remedy should be in place. These are still voluntary, they're non-judicial mechanisms. In some states, they have a lot more teeth than others. So for example, in Canada, if you don't participate in this negotiation process, then you're barred from future public procurement contracts. So it does have some teeth. But yeah, like I said, I think the biggest driver and the biggest incentive is the compliance incentive, and that's already in 75% of OECD countries.
So much. So I think we can now go to our final panelist. Sabrina, welcome. Can you hear what's going on in the room?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Thanks so much. Can you hear me?
We can. So welcome and please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate Rashad's nod to the EU AI Act. So I think this presentation fits perfectly. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm going to talk today about how the EU AI Act, so the law by the European Union on AI, fosters trust along the general purpose AI value chain. I'm joining you from Brussels, from the European AI Office. That's a team within the European Commission, so the executive arm of the EU. And we're first going to look at a statement that our President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, gave in February at the AI Action Summit that sets out a bit the current way how the European Union is thinking about general purpose AI, where she talked about ever more powerful AI models having been released, and that we now need to build together a shared consensus that AI will be safe. But we also need to understand the vision of where we want AI to take us as society and as humanity. And the EU AI Act plays an important role in this regard. Today, I'm going to talk about how the AI Act ensures trust along the value chain, as mentioned, and I'm going to deep dive on some highlights, how we try to make it simple and effective, and then provide a brief outlook at the end. So first, the EU AI Act is the first ever comprehensive legal framework on AI in the world. It's been a big push across 27 member states. The idea was that AI will play an increasingly important role in our economy, and it's better if there are harmonized rules across 27 member states rather than Germany, France, Sweden, each of them having their own approach to AI, and hence the EU agreed on this law that basically says AI will be extremely beneficial for society, but then there are some outcomes that we want to prevent from happening, and hence we put a legal framework around it, which then also enables startups to be as trustworthy as large companies, because it's very clear what you have to follow. And so you have a minimum standard of quality in AI products in Europe, which should also increase the demand for AI. So this is like our policy vision, how to navigate the transition to ever more powerful AI, which then also gives access to the entire European market. So if someone from the UK or the US and other countries would like to deploy in Europe, then they have to comply once with this law, and then it's quite easy for them. Let's look at the value chain, which is the topic of the workshop series here. The AI Act started out thinking about the applications in specific use cases. So the AI systems that directly affect the people using AI. So the idea of the AI Act was always to ensure that Europeans can trust what AI has to offer. So the focus was what AI systems will actually impact them. And then when ChatGPT happened and so on, the co-legislators from the parliament and the member states understood, oh, there's a shift in the value chain where there are a few general purpose AI models that start to power a lot of these AI systems. And hence the final AI Act then addressed this entire value chain to ensure that this works seamlessly and safely together. So that there's trust and legal certainty along the value chain. What this means is that if you first look at the systems that directly impact us day to day, so for example, when we apply for a new job and there's a recruitment tool that looks through our applications via AI, then we would like to be sure that this is done in a trustworthy way. And hence there's a pyramid that the EU has set up on how to govern AI systems. And essentially most use cases are permitted without any restrictions. Then there are a few yellow, a few transparency risks that we would like to address. So for example, one should know when one interacts with a chatbot or when there's a deep fake. So there are some transparency obligations related to that. Then there are a few use cases where we say along the value chain, there could be a high level of risk, for example, in recruitment or when AI is used in medical devices, where there are more extensive rules to ensure that this is being done in a safe way. And ultimately, there's a small set of systems that are seen to be not in line with European values, and these should be entirely prohibited. So, for example, around social scoring. This is, however, at the end of the value chain. So when a system directly interacts with a user. Now the question comes in, what do we do about the models that increasingly power these systems? And here, and this is the focus of my work, I'm coordinating our work on general purpose AI models, is that we have established transparency rules for all general purpose AI models. And the providers of these models also need to follow copyright related rules from the European Union. The transparency rules essentially mean you have to document what your model is capable of doing and how you've built it. So some parameters there in order for anyone downstream who wants to use the model so that they know how they can integrate it into their system so that this value chain essentially works. In addition, we say that there are a few models that are at the frontier of development, so the most advanced models that could pose potentially systemic risks to the Union. And here we demand risk management in line what the colleague earlier outlined of like assessing risks and mitigating risks along the value chain. It was mentioned earlier that it's extremely important that that policy on AI is being done in a way that can easily adapt. And here the tool that we are using in the EU is a so-called code of practice that details out the rules for transparency, copyright, and risk management. But it's being written by independent experts, so not by the European Commission, but we appointed independent experts to lead this, and we only approved the code at the end. Interesting here is how do we deal with the increasing complexity of AI that is both at the international level, but then also in every single commune in Europe with these effects. And so we've built a governance structure that's both at the EU level and at the national level. So the rules for general purpose AI models will be enforced by the European AI office where I'm working at. And the rules for AI systems, so use case specific rules, will be enforced at the national level, so by the different countries in the European Union. And all of them can work together with independent experts through a scientific panel. So we're extremely aware that scientific input will be important to keep regulation and the implementation up to date. And there's also an advisory forum through which we can interact with other stakeholders from civil society or various industry actors to make sure that there's a knowledge exchange. Let's look at the highlights, how we simplify the rules. So it's important these days that Europe wants to be bold, simple, and fast. AI is having significant effects already, and it's important for competitiveness and innovation, as well as for safety and security. So it's important to strike a balance here. And so we focus on having simple rules and enforcing them effectively. I already touched on the General Purpose AI Code of Practice. That's this innovative approach to involving independent experts, detailing out the state of the art in risk management and transparency obligations, so that then the companies that develop general purpose AI models that could pose systemic risks, they can then use this as a tool to demonstrate compliance. And essentially, it's the first time that legal rules are turned into more details for how you develop and deploy general purpose AI in a safe and trustworthy way in the context of a legal framework. And this code should be finalized by July, because the rules for these general purpose AI model providers apply from August this year onwards. So we're in the final sprint to make this happen. We're getting ready for this by making sure that the European ecosystem and the entire value chain actors, they understand who is in scope of these rules and who is out of scope. There's been some misunderstanding how much downstream actors that are only fine-tuning these general purpose AI models would need to comply with the rules. And we really want to make sure that it's very targeted on the actors that can actually carry the responsibility for assessing and mitigating risks from these models. So we're detailing this out. We're also building up a network of evaluators, because one of our competencies is to evaluate how risky and how good the risk mitigations are of these models. And here we want to work with independent experts on the outside. So we're building up this network to advance the evaluation science. In all of this, for the policy makers and enforcers, it's important to have like the secure infrastructure in place, so that also the businesses and the entire public can trust that this is all done in a secure and effective way. And ultimately, we build up the governance structure so that it's not just us enforcing the rules, but we're in constant contact with how the state of the art advances. Let's look at the research opportunities to shape best practices in this context. I was asked by the colleagues at Cambridge about this. So what could be done by researchers to support the policy framework that we're building? And one interesting aspect is that the Code of Practice details out the legal framework. So they detail out the AI Act. But then the Code of Practice refers to the current state of the art, which is constantly evolving. And so if researchers make progress in defining what the state of the art in evaluations or internal governance procedures or whistleblowing looks like, then this would directly feed into how the European Union holds these companies accountable, because the Code of Practice is essentially the tool that links us to the current state of the art. So any progress here is very welcome. Similarly, ideally from August onwards, industry actually has to adapt their business practices to comply with our rules. And while we do our enforcement, we also often benefit from the researchers, but also actors along the value chain to alert us if they see that some business practices for risk mitigation or alike are not effective. So here researchers can also make a strong contribution when they're anyways monitoring how the landscape evolves. And ultimately, the mandate of the AI Office is not only on the AI Act, but we also engage in a lot of international cooperation with at the OECD level, for example, but of course also G7, G20, bilaterals with the US, UK, and others. And here, if there's policy relevant research that suggests what an actor like the European Union with 27 member states should push for, then of course this can also be, we can use these levers to like advocate for change through international cooperation, but also other levers like, for example, funding that we can give out. So any research here is very much welcome. That was my input, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sabrina. One quick follow-up question about that enforcement part, if I may.
Sure.
And as we've been discussing here, the AI value chain is an overly simple way of describing a very complex ecosystem that's broad in scope. So my question is about monitoring, actually, and what mechanisms are there for monitoring beyond relying on individual researchers and their own interests?
Yes, of course. First, we directly engage with the companies that should adhere to the rules, right? So there's like a direct relationship there, where they are required to give us information that we can then directly check. But in addition, we're setting up various different governance structures so that we get additional information in. And for example, the scientific panel will bring together leading academic experts. There will actually be a call published quite soon, so that people can be for 2 years in this panel. And it's their job then essentially to alert us on any developments that we should then again take into account. And similarly, we will also offer like a direct complaint mechanism to downstream actors that integrate these models into their systems. So we kind of like want to be very accessible for anyone who wants to alert on what they see in the world. But also, of course, we do our own monitoring. We just want to be sure that the net is like as stringent as possible.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can invite the other panelists back, and we have some time for reflections and conversation. Sabrina, if you're happy to stay up there, we'll keep you on the screen, and you might need to shout out if you want to be in case I don't see you. Steve, put his hand up first.
So I'm fascinated by the European dimension to this discussion, and I suppose the core question is whether we should be having a policy debate within the UK about what we do, or whether we should be part of the larger European debate. And I think it's a difficult question because my instinct is that, of course, we're part of Europe, but there is a tension. I think tension comes out in the Draghi report, which talks about, on the one hand, the importance of the single market, on the other hand, the risk of overly prescriptive regulation. And I used to represent the UK in Bennett, which covered all telecoms regulation across the EU. And I saw that firsthand. There was always this great benefit of working together, but the risk that the lever you used to bring everyone together was regulation. I suppose the acids test for us now in the AI context is whether for the UK, should we be trying to converge with the EU AI Act, or consciously diverge? That's probably a provocative way of putting it, but essentially, should we see ourselves as part of a European debate, or should we be going our own way?
So I think there are two sub-questions there, and one, Sabrina, you might pick up, is about this concern about over-regulation. And Bill, you were the person who mentioned national policy might not be possible, so I'll bring you in after Sabrina.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Of course, we're having this debate in the EU a lot, and we recently put out the AI Continent Action Plan, and 4 pillars focus on promoting innovation and funding opportunities and the like. And the 5th pillar is about simplifying the AI Act. And so we're making a big push to showing that you can have a law that's effective, but at the same time simple for companies to comply with. And for example, this code of practice is one way how we try to bring in industry a lot, because the independent experts talk with industry in like specific workshops to make sure that the voluntary tool hears their voices, but also civil society and academic voices. And then at the same time, we go out more to industry and we offer them basically a service desk where they can ask us anything. And so we just put in a lot of like capacity to make sure that it can be understandable what you have to do. So you can still have a law, but it's also understandable for businesses and doesn't hamper innovation.
And I'll pick up with the impossible bit of that,
Yes.
which is whether it's possible to act if like national policy is at all feasible. I'm starting to think, and the last 2 days have helped me in that realization, that this period of regulating AI is temporary. That this is a phase we're going through as we see the emergence of these technologies. They are incredibly visible. There's vast investment in them, and we haven't yet settled into a space where they are just part of the broader infrastructure. And in that context, it may not matter, because the forces that are shaping the deployment of the technology are actually global. And so we might be better off thinking about almost short-term advantage to be in a position to benefit from what comes afterwards, rather than trying to do our own things now. And if I took that perspective, I'd be much more allied with the EU and the thoughtfulness of the AI Act than either what's happening in China or the US, frankly, as a way almost to shelter us from the storm for a bit. And then we, at the end of that point, we still have then the freedom to diverge if we feel it's necessary, once there's a deeper understanding and public awareness of what these technologies are actually doing. So it's a cop-out, really.
It's okay, because Rashad is going to answer as well.
Also a little bit of a cop out, just to say. So I just wanted to give the OECD perspective and on risk management policy specifically. While I can't comment on whether the UK should align with the EU AI Act, I can say that it's our position that all OECD countries can benefit from converging towards a single international framework. Interoperability can only help achieve the objectives of actually addressing these risks and reducing these risks, because it makes risk management more efficient. It makes cooperation across jurisdictions more efficient. I mean, AI value chains are global. There's no denying that. And so consistent policies and consistent expectations on companies across borders can only benefit both the companies, but also the governments in actually achieving their policy objectives. So we would say convergence around already endorsed international standards is probably beneficial for everyone.
I'd agree with what everybody's said so far. But I think I would also add that actually the opportunities for the UK to go its own way are diminishing with time very quickly. So the AI Act, not unlike GDPR, has a Brussels effect that will impact us. And what companies are looking for, particularly those that operate both in the UK headquartered and operate in the UK, but also in Europe, are doing is they are creating their own compliance regimes internally to match and meet the requirements of the EU AI Act. And that's having a knock-on effect in terms of their supply chains here in the UK. So whether we like it or not, actually UK industry is conforming to the AI Act. And in the absence of UK regulation to change that, that is the direction of travel. So I think it's almost a moot point unless government acts quickly to identify and regulate for the differences or the exceptions that they can see in terms of compliance with the AI Act that would benefit the UK. They're going to lose this argument, or they're going to place burdens on UK industry that's already chosen to comply, and in doing so lose any advantage that might otherwise have been gained.
There is a tension there, isn't there? And if you think about the conversation about this in the G20, there's a lot of focus on digital sovereignty. And if you're thinking about the kind of structure that Jade is setting out for us, things that are acceptable in some societies might vary quite widely. So I guess the question is, if you're a middle power like the UK or Canada, where are you going to converge to? And how many poles of convergence might there be globally? That's a statement. You don't have to answer the question if you don't want to. Alex, and then Zai.
I think I want to just ask the question just to grab the ball. Sorry. I think it's unbelievably fascinating. It's the first time when I disagree with the whole panel, and I'm just enjoying this. I have a lot of questions, but I will focus on honestly only 3 of them. So first one, it's mostly to Aled. It's slightly difficult for me to understand this logic. So You mentioned security, but at the same time in narrative, you're quite clear about election, waters, etc. So the time scope of AI development regulation is quite limited only for the needs for this government. But in security perspective, AI is about strategy and strategic compliance. So my question would be, where is the vision and strategy for the country, not for the government and not for the administration? The second question to the whole panel, right? We discussed a lot about public values, public interest, etc. But from literature, we know that in polarized societies, it's super difficult to define. And I will use this example with Brexit. 52% public value interested to leave UK, EU, I'm sorry, and 38% thinks it will stay with European Union. So in the debate around AI, how we will define public interest and public value to be rooted to the any approaches to AI. And last to Sabrina, because I think it's only you or you from your office can answer this. Can you explain the logic that European Union launched comprehensive law first and then von der Leyen asked about vision to AI? So what is the foundation for this AI Act if there is no vision and strategy, but it's already existing AI comprehensive law? So what is the political logic here? Thank you.
Thank you for 3 challenging questions. Alex, let's take them in order. Aled.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I think one of the pitfalls of democracy is we get confined ultimately to short-term thinking through electoral cycles. Governments don't know if they'll be here in several years' time. They have to respond to a media cycle. They have a limited amount of political capital. And remember that AI is a very small part of a very challenging agenda that this government wants to get through. And regardless of who is in government in the next election cycle, they will have equal challenges that will probably supersede this in a lot of ways to move forward. So it is just one element, but I think it's a very significant one in terms of having to take seriously concerns around things like security, etc. And those actually can be dealt with through non-political means, like technical standards, like the work of AC, international cooperation, etc., and through the work of existing regulators and the power that they have, particularly in terms of outputs of systems which may be using AI. But ultimately, the harmful outputs that we want to avoid are already covered by legislation or regulation to avoid. And AI is just a new means of potentially exacerbating or correcting those problems. So I think that's the first part of it. I think the second then, in terms of where does the vision come from? That's the difficult part, squaring the circles of how do you maintain security and what should you do about security, how much political capital you have to make those decisions, and ultimately ensure that you've got a response that can tick all the right boxes. And that's where the risk element comes in. What are they willing to risk getting wrong in order to act? And that's not an easy question to ask when you are looking down the barrel of the next election cycle.
Bill on public value, polarization.
Yes, I mean, they're all very good points. I think that the big answer is nobody should have a vision for AI because it's not a thing you have a vision for. You have a vision for stuff in the context of AI. You have an industrial strategy in the context of AI. You have a strategy for bringing a fractured public together and resisting the rise of right-wing populism in the context of AI. And so almost to anticipate a potential answer to Sabrina above me, which is that we're not looking for a vision for AI at all, because it's so widespread, it's such a disparate range of things. What we need to do is to control the technology long enough to allow us to decide how it will serve the other aspects of our vision for what a good society is and how we deliver public value across the realm. So in my particular context of broadcast media, enormous challenges by the availability of these very disruptive technologies that interfere in all aspects of the creative process whilst not themselves being creative. And we're trying to deal with them. What I like to see is the fact that regulation is stopping the untrammeled deployment of these tools thanks to things like the OECD framework, long enough for us to understand how they fit in the context of what we're trying to achieve and what our vision is for the future of public broadcasting or public service broadcasting. So I'd turn your question around slightly.
And Sabrina, do you want to follow up on that question of vision?
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, so the vision by the EU for AI was always about trust and excellence. So it's about that Europeans can trust what AI has to offer, but also that they that basically it creates the environment for like excellence in AI and like developing AI that serves us again. And yeah, it ties in with the question what von der Leyen, our president, meant there. And she talked about where AI might take us, right? And so if you read the rest of her speech, then she talks about that right now we're at the beginning of AI adoption. The technology is like developing quickly. We do not yet know where the most beneficial use cases are, but we kind of like want to shape where this technology is going. And so you probably don't set a vision once, but you like need to adapt to the reality of the technology and the geopolitical context. So the AI Act creates the fundamental basis for trust, but then let's see where it takes us.
Thank you. Lisa, do you want to comment on that? I've got a question from online, which is interesting. And it's a question about digital literacy, really. I mean, a couple of you, Alan and Jade, in your different ways, underlined the importance of public digital literacy for participation, governance, all those good things. The question is, how do we avoid a digital divide whilst trying to bring about that kind of literacy? So Jade, you gave us this very nice sequence of formal codification to a queryable version to something accessible. Could you say a bit more about what accessible looks like in the context of educating the public and avoiding digital divide? With the microphone, thank you.
In the context of engineers I'm working with, which is a fragment of the public, I'm addressing an audience that has technical skills, but perhaps not in all the areas that are required to build a chip. Right? They might be specialists at a certain area of the architecture and not another one. So they are highly skilled and have can make some expert guesses at another area, but they need a way to process the spec without having to dive into all the math the machine produces, or at least I don't want to have to ask them to read the math. And so stepping stone towards that is the tool that you can query to ask it questions still in a codified way. And that's often good enough for engineers because they will handle the codified way. A step further than that is, can we take the same idea further and ask a tool through a conversational query in English or French, as the case may be, is this behavior allowed, whatever the behavior might be. So that's what I'm trying to promote at ARM, and I think we could attempt to reproduce in the more public sphere.
What do you think, Alan? Would that work for the broader public?
Well, I think that first of all, there's a lot to be said for the model that's being described. In particular, I'm really taken with this analogy of the Russian dolls. How do you get from a very basic explanation that's digestible to any layperson and connect it through a series of explanations that become increasingly more layered and complicated, that takes you right down to the truth of it, which is obviously the mathematics and the algorithm? That, I think, is a really helpful visual aid that can be used to, you don't need to understand it, but it at least shows that there is a connection between the technical and the comprehensible for most people, myself definitely included in that. But that's a key part, is finding the right way to communicate this in terms of reaching the right audiences. I mentioned when I was speaking earlier that actually government during the pandemic, for example, had a really good information campaign, public education campaign that really worked on this. And part of that meant targeting underrepresented groups and presenting this information in a way that was relevant and accessible and through a variety of media in order to make sure that there was maximum penetration in that space. Now we have the education sector, obviously, that we can influence to help deliver on this. We have media that can reach people and targeted advertising, targeted campaigns in that sense. So there are ways of actually reaching quite a broad audience with this. And by having, as I say, this, this structure that leads through increasing complication, you can also target it at the right levels of understanding and tailor the message to different audiences. So I think there are ways of doing it. You need the political will, you need the right structures, and you need to make sure, obviously, that it's very well funded. And there, as ever, comes the complication. So
I've got some more online, but is there other questions in the room? Jai?
So my only question is that many people seem to be worried about the job displacement effect of AI, and there has already been a lot of conversation in this domain. However, with how fast AI is growing and evolving, it seems that displacements in certain jobs and sectors may be unavoidable in the next maybe 10, 20 years. So in that sense, do you think AI represents an opportunity for people to actually work because they want to, not to meet basic needs or to survive, and people to participate in education because they actually want to learn about those things? And in that sense, should there be more talk about, besides AI regulation, should there be more talk about building things like a basic social infrastructure to sort of support that idea? Thank you.
Thank you, Zai. Broad question. Anybody want to have a go at that?
In this country, of course, we used to have a basic social infrastructure, and it was very nice while it lasted. So it'd be quite nice to see it back again, and delivered humanely. So just, story. We don't yet know actually how the current wave of AI technologies will disrupt work. One of us referred to the fact that experimentation has been done. The experimentation shows lots of impact, but actual deployment on the ground has yet to demonstrate real impact. The case study, the example that I'm constantly quoted is software developers who are massively increased their productivity because they're using AI. And as one of my fellow friends, who's the director of engineering, pointed out, they may increase their coding capacity, but that's such a small part of what any software engineer does, that the actual impact on their job productivity is probably only 1 or 2%. Because most software developers don't spend their time writing code, they spend their time thinking about what code to write. And so I don't think we can yet anticipate where the disruption and change is going to go. And so what I'd rather see is, if like, societal preparations for some form of disruption, like the social net you talk about, rather than specific conversations about our knowledge workers or accountants or other people going to be losing their job. And I'd rather not see the sort of self-serving ridiculousness that we see from some of the more senior commentators, of which my personal favourite yesterday was Mark Andreessen, the founder of Andreessen Horowitz Capital, saying every job's going to go apart from being a VC because that's the one that really requires human creativity. It's like, yeah, Mark, every job's going apart from yours. How odd. So I think we need a broader debate around how, as a society, we'll cope with disruption, rather than trying to imagine at the moment we know what that's going to look like.
Although we didn't cope with disruption very well in previous waves of automation. Alan.
Sorry.
So I'd agree with the point, particularly about not coping previously, and so having a plan in place is crucial, because we do see the disruption coming. But there's also reason to be optimistic insofar as previous disruptions have not completely destroyed the labour market. Things have changed. It hasn't been smooth. I think it's our responsibility to make sure that it is smoother than it has been in previous disruptions. But one of the other things to think about as well is that there's naivety, again, particularly in the private sector, around what are the savings that will be made, or what savings are made possible by automation and AI. And those companies which have worked moved very quickly to reduce headcount because AI is is this cost-cutting saving grace that means they can get rid of staff, have actually found that that's not the case, because ultimately, yet again, it is a tool. It is a means, not an end, and it enhances the efficiency of workers. It does not replace the thinking that goes into them, as the point about software developers illustrates perfectly. And so actually, there's probably reason to be cautiously optimistic in that sense, that actually, as thinking becomes more mature, we'll see how AI supplements, it does not replace in an awful lot of circumstances. One of the challenges that I do see us having is actually in terms of the positive messaging around this, what job opportunities does AI bring? So there's lots of talk about, for example, data centers being set up in areas of deprivation and providing new jobs. Well, actually, they're not likely to provide substantial new employment in significant numbers. And so I think we have a risk that actually there's too much fear in terms of the risks, but there's perhaps too much positivity in terms of the direct employment opportunities that will come from greater AI adoption as well.
Does employment risk feature in the OECD risk framework?
Excuse me, yes, but to a limited extent. So we had to agree among our governments and among the experts on where company responsibility and accountability, kind of where the limits of that were. Efficiencies resulting in less hiring is not necessarily an adverse impact that a company should be held accountable for. At the same time, introducing a technology that displaces a lot of workers without informing the workers and consulting and being transparent with the workers could cause serious impacts. And this is something that we recommend in our guidance that companies do, that if you are introducing this technology in the hiring process and performance evaluation and choosing who to fire, that workers are adequately informed. They're not being surveilled and monitored in ways that violate other rights, and that companies are just being transparent with how they're deploying the technology, so that broader impacts on society are caused. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question from online, Sabrina, specifically for you. If you could write the EU AI Act again today, what would you do differently, if anything?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a governance expert at the team, so I would not have written it. Honestly, on my part of the AI Act, it's quite unique that it's so short. So the general purpose AI part of the AI Act is just like a tiny fraction of the entire law. Maybe colleagues would have done something else on the rest, but at least there the wording was quite carefully put in a way so that it's kind of like there are a lot of mechanisms that allow us to detail out and specify the law later on as technology evolves. And I think that was a very wise choice by the negotiators at the time. I think the question is rather, now that the code of practice is being written, which will be a much more detailed document detailing out the state of the art of what you need to do to comply with these rules. Here we need like very strong updating mechanisms, because as soon as you go into a lot of detail, then these details will be obsolete as like the technology advances and the adoption increases. And so I'd rather like to channel that energy to the code of practice that will be done over the next few months. And then we should have another chat in a year's time.
Good answer. Let me turn to the room. Would anybody else rewrite the EU AI or any other legislation? Any volunteers? Steve is nodding. Steve, how would you redo it? And lob the microphone over there.
So I really like the principles that Sabrina just set out for her part of the AI Act, and it reflects the example I worked on was net neutrality regulation, where we had a massive argument about whether you try and define in a very detailed way the way in which these technologies will evolve, or just set out some principles. So I think what Sabrina just described is absolutely right, but it's an approach that is not applied more generally. It's not applied, of course, I think, much of the rest of the AI Act. I don't think it's the approach that's really applied to GDPR, for example. I would certainly have a go at rewriting GDPR.
There'd be a lot of supporters for that one. Other questions in the room?
Thank you. A very short question. I wanted to know if you could, Sabrina, elaborate a bit more on the enforcement of the AI Act and explain where you will source the technical expertise to verify the information disclosed by the companies providing general purpose AI models.
Yes, very happy to do that. So first could be good to outline the enforcement powers that we have. So as mentioned, the general purpose AI rules are enforced by the AI office. And what we do here first is like we receive documentation from the companies, and hence if the code of practice is being approved, then according to the code of practice, they would need to, for example, set up a safety and security framework and how they manage systemic risks, and they need to have structures in place how they engage with external assessors and the like, and this all needs to be documented. So first we receive this documentation and then we check it. Then we can request additional information if this is not enough for us, or we want to do spot checks or like. We can, as that's then more the technical questions, we can also conduct evaluations ourselves and then request measures from providers when we find that they're not compliant in how they assess and mitigate systemic risks or the transparency and copyright related rules. And the technical expertise for all of this that is extremely relevant here is being built up right now. So since last summer, we've been hiring a lot of technical colleagues. Some joined us, for example, from UKAC, others joined us from other research organizations or companies. And this is being done in a technical unit, the sister unit to ours. And by the end of the year, we should have a squad of 40 experts there that are then able to provide technical expertise, in addition to the technical expertise that we would get, for example, through the scientific panel. But it's of course quite challenging, but we see that a lot of colleagues want to join us, also from the companies that they would then regulate, because they see the impact that they can have here, and we're quite a fast-moving team, and so it's quite a startup mode on our end, so that helps.
There's a question from online to which the answer is obviously yes, which is there a need for civil servants to have technical skills with respect to AI and so on?
Well, we don't even get to debate that. Moving on.
Well, do you disagree? You feel free to disagree.
No, I'm not going to disagree. I like the stuff.
Are there other questions? I think we are drawing towards the end, but I want to turn to each panel member in turn. We'll go in the same order as before and ask you, I mean, it's been a really wide-ranging discussion, but ask you to reflect back on this panel, anything else you've heard here. What is your main takeaway? If you're thinking about what does the research community need to take away, or the policy community, what's your main takeaway, Alan?
So I think the key takeaway is very much around the fact that collaboration is key. Interdisciplinary approaches are key, and ensuring that when we're thinking about policy, we don't forget to link it to the technical aspects that we really need to keep in mind moving forward.
I'd go with that. I'd say that AI is not one thing, it's not monolithic, and we must never allow ourselves to believe that it is. And in fact, the sectoral approach in the UK, the Sunak government advocated, seems to have been quite foresightful and quite sensible and intelligent. We need to build laws and regulations that are adaptive, because this has not stopped. And if you've been in a driverless car recently, okay, well, be prepared for humanoid robots on the street and pouring your coffee, because they are already being built and they are coming. There are going to be whole new challenges about how we adapt to new deployments of these systems. And thinking constantly about, if we really want this to benefit society, benefit the public, what are the benefits we're looking for? And then how do we apply that to AI? Not what is AI doing? How do we extract value from it? Seems to me the way we need to think about it.
Thank you. Jade.
The question was the main takeaways, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
What have you taken away?
Yeah, that I think I know or understand very little of the majority of this crowd preoccupation. And so it's been a struggle to understand what's with the obsession to regulate, for example, when we don't even understand what the systems are doing. It's not inherent to AI. I don't think we understand fully what computed systems we interact with do. So I would like to understand more, but perhaps there's a need to help me understand more. And by me, I mean my community. And I think it goes both ways, perhaps to your point that this crowd or similar crowds may have things to learn from, like I said, semanticists and computer scientists, so that we can at least talk to each other in meaningful ways. Yeah.
Excuse me. So one takeaway from my kind of very niche look at this is the importance of the value chain. That we don't just focus on very narrow aspects of the technology or the developers, but focus on the entire value chain when developing policies, thinking about very comprehensively whose responsibilities lie where the impacts are occurring, and where different aspects of the value chain can benefit society. So I think that's a really important takeaway, is that we take a really comprehensive look at this, more comprehensive than what is currently covered in legislation, and yeah, just think about the entire value chain.
Thank you. Sabrina.
Aled, as the first speaker, had asked what's holding policymakers back from taking significant decisions. And my takeaway from today is that we just need a lot of progress in evidence-based policy choices. And we also need demand from researchers and the wider public that these decisions are being made by the policymakers.
Great, thank you so much. There isn't any sort of definite agenda to follow up on this event. It has been a fantastic conversation. I've learned a lot over the past day and a half. I think the hope was that it would generate some ideas for future research, policy action, for people to connect with each other. So feel free to do so. And if the Bennett Institute can help in making any of those connections, let us know, or if you want to follow up in any way. But with that, I'm going to draw things to a close. We've got time still to have a chat to each other before we all disperse, but please join me in thanking our panelist speakers. Thank you all so much.